Early in 1912, I left my post as a science master at Dulwich College in South London and set about arranging a tour around the United States in the early spring of that year. I decided to cross in the latest addition to the White Star Fleet, the RMS Titanic, because it seemed it would be rather a novelty to be on board the largest ship yet launched. The night before sailing, the night of Tuesday, April the 9th, I spent in a hotel in Southampton. It's pathetic to recall that as I sat the following morning in the breakfast room, from the windows of which could be seen the four huge funnels of the Titanic towering over the roofs of the various shipping offices opposite, there sat behind me three of the Titanic's passengers discussing the coming voyage and estimating, among other things, the probabilities of an accident at sea to the ship. As I rose from breakfast, I glanced at the group and recognized them later on board. But they were not among the number who answered to the roll call on the Carpathia on the following Monday morning. Soon after noon, the gangways were withdrawn and the Titanic moved slowly down the dock. We dropped down Spithead, past the shores of the Isle of Wight, and in the calmest weather made for Cherbourg, stopping briefly to pick up passengers and mail before setting sail for Queenstown. We took on board our pilot and ran slowly towards the harbour with the sounding line dropping all the time, and came to a stop rather suddenly, our screws churning up the bottom and turning the sea brown with sand from below. To stand as far astern as possible and to look over the side from the top deck, forwards and downwards, to where the mail tenders rolled at her bows, it was easy to appreciate what a magnificent boat the Titanic was. So stately and quite enormous. There's very little to relate from the time of leaving Queenstown on Thursday to Sunday morning. The sea was calm. So calm indeed that very few were absent from meals. The wind was westerly or southwesterly, but often rather cold, and with the thought that we had seen the last of land until we set foot on the shores of America, I spent a good deal of time in the library, reading and writing letters to friends, which I posted in the box outside the library door. Possibly they are there yet. Coming now to Sunday, it'll be interesting perhaps to give the day's events in some detail. Service was held in the saloon by the purser in the morning, and going on deck after lunch, we found such a change in temperature that not many cared to remain to face the bitter wind. The wind, I believe, created entirely by the ship's rapid motion through the chilly atmosphere. Returning to the library, I stopped for a moment to read the day's run and to observe our position on the chart. The Reverend Mr. Carter, a Church of England clergyman, was similarly engaged, and he asked me if I was well enough acquainted with the purser to request the use of the saloon for a hymn sing-song in the evening. I'm happy to say the purser gave his consent at once. I'd enjoyed several conversations with Mr. Carter. He spoke of the impossibility of conducting his parish work without the help his wife gave. I mention the Carters particularly because they were good people who I didn't see again. The library was crowded that afternoon, owing to the cold on deck, but through the windows the sun shone brightly, auguring a fine night and a clear day ahead, and the prospect of landing in 2 days in New York was generally satisfying to us all. I can look back and see every detail of the library that afternoon. The beautifully furnished room with lounges, armchairs, and small writing or card tables scattered about, writing bureaus round the walls of the room, and the library in glass-cased shelves flanking one side, all finished in mahogany, with white-fluted wooden columns that supported the deck above. Through the windows there's the covered corridor reserved by general consent as the children's playground. In the corridor is a man and his wife with 2 children. They're all young and happy. He's dressed in a grey knickerbocker suit, a camera slung over his shoulders. I didn't see any of them again. Close beside me, so near that I cannot avoid hearing scraps of their conversation, are 2 American ladies, both dressed in white, young, probably friends only. One had been to India, returning by way of England. The other is a schoolteacher, a graceful girl with a distinguished air, heightened by a pair of pince-nez. Engaged in conversation with them is a gentleman whom I subsequently identified from a photograph as a well-known resident of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Genial, polished, with a courtly air towards the ladies. A child breaks in on their conversation from time to time. I saw none of this group again. In the opposite corner are a young American cinema photographer and his French wife who plays Patience. He sits back in his chair, interposing from time to time. I didn't see them again. In the middle of the room are 2 Catholic priests, one quietly reading, the other dark, bearded, with broad-brimmed hat, talking earnestly to a friend in German about something in the open Bible in front of him. I saw none of them again. Many other faces recur to thought. Of all the people in the library that afternoon, I can remember only 2 or 3 who found their way to the Carpathia. Looking over this room with his back to the library shelves is the library steward, thin, stooping, sad-faced, and generally with nothing to do but serve out books. After dinner, Mr. Carter invited all who wished to the saloon, and to the accompaniment on the piano of a young Scottish engineer, going out to join his brother fruit farming at the foot of the Rockies. He started some 100 passengers singing hymns. It was curious to see how many requested hymns dealing with dangers at sea. I noticed the hushed tone with which all sang the hymn for those in peril on the sea. The singing went on until about 10 o'clock, and there were several stewards standing about waiting to serve biscuits and coffee before going off duty. Mr. Carter brought the evening to a close, thanking the purser for the use of the saloon, and saying a few words on the happiness and safety of the voyage hitherto, of the great confidence all felt on board this great liner with her steadiness and her size, and the happy outlook of landing in a few hours in New York. I retired to my cabin at about 11:15. I'd been fortunate enough to secure a 2-berth cabin to myself, D56, quite close to the saloon and most convenient in every way for getting about the ship. After undressing and climbing into the top berth, I read from about 11:15 to about 12:15. During this time, I noticed particularly the increased vibration of the ship, and I assumed we were going at a higher speed than at any time since we sailed from Queenstown. 2 things led me to this conclusion. First, that as I sat on the sofa undressing with bare feet on the floor, the jar of the vibration came up from the engines below very noticeably. Second, that as I sat up in the berth reading, the spring mattress supporting me was vibrating more rapidly than usual. Now, this cradle-like motion was always noticeable as one lay in bed. But that night, there was certainly a marked increase in the motion. And then, in the quietness of the night, broken only by the muffled sound that came to me through the ventilators of stewards talking and moving along the corridors, there came what seemed nothing more than an extra heave of the engines and a more than usually obvious dancing motion of the mattress on which I sat. Nothing more than that. No sound of a crash or anything else. No sense of shock. No jar that felt like one heavy mass meeting another. and presently the same thing repeated, with about the same intensity. The thought came to me that they must have still further increased the speed. And all this time the Titanic was being cut open by an iceberg, and water was pouring in her side. It fills me with astonishment now to think of it. Here was this enormous vessel running starboard side onto an iceberg, and a passenger sitting quietly in bed reading felt no motion or list to the opposite side, and this must have been felt, had it been more than the usual roll of the ship. Never very much in the calm weather we'd had. And so, with no thought of anything serious having happened to the ship, I continued my reading. And still the murmur from the stewards and from adjoining cabins, and no other sound. No cry in the night, no alarm given. But in a few moments, I felt the engines slow and stop. The dancing motion and the vibration ceased suddenly, after being part of our very existence for 4 days. And that was the first hint that anything out of the ordinary had happened. I jumped out of bed and slipped on a dressing gown over my pyjamas, put on shoes and went out of my cabin into the hall near the saloon. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, opened the vestibule door to the top deck, and stepped out into an atmosphere that cut me like a knife. Walking to the starboard side, I peered over and saw the sea some 70 feet below, calm and black. Forward, the deserted deck stretching away to the first-class quarters and the captain's bridge, and behind, the steerage quarters and the stern bridge. Nothing more. No iceberg on either side or astern as far as we could see in the darkness. There were 2 or 3 men on deck, and with one, the Scottish engineer who had played the piano earlier, I compared notes. He had just started to undress when the engine stopped, and had come up at once, so he was fairly well clad. All being quiet and still, we went down to the next deck. Through the windows of the smoking room we saw a game of cards going on, with several onlookers, and went in to inquire if they knew more than we did. But none of them had gone on deck to make any inquiries, even though one of them had seen an iceberg go by, towering above us. He'd called the others' attention to it, and they all watched it disappear astern, but then at once resumed the game. I expect the iceberg has scratched off some of her new paint, and the captain doesn't like to go on until she's painted up again, said one. We laughed, and one of the players, pointing at the glass of whisky standing at his elbow, said, "Just run along the deck and see if any ice has come aboard. I'd like some for this." I never saw any of the occupants of that smoking room again. Nearly all young men, full of hope for their prospects in a new world. I decided to go on deck again, but as it was too cold to do so in a dressing gown, I went to my cabin, dressed in a Norfolk jacket and trousers, and walked up again. There were now more people walking about, but no new information was forthcoming. The ship had now resumed her course, moving very slowly through the water, with a little line of white foam either side of the bow. I think we were all glad to see this. I decided to go down again, and as I crossed from the starboard to the port side, I saw an officer climb onto the last lifeboat on the port side, number 16, and begin to throw off the cover. But no one seemed to pay him any particular attention. As I passed to the door to go down, I looked forward and saw, to my surprise, an undoubted tilt downwards from the stern to the bows. Only a slight slope, which I don't think anyone had noticed. At any rate, they had not remarked on it. So I went back to my cabin and sat on the sofa and read for some 10 minutes. And then I heard through the open door above, "All passengers on deck with lifebelts on." I placed 2 books I was reading in the side pockets of my Norfolk jacket, picked up my lifebelt and my dressing gown, and walked upstairs tying on my lifebelt. Upon reaching the top deck again, I found many people assembled there, some fully dressed with coats and wraps, well prepared for anything that might happen. Others had thrown wraps hastily around them when they were called and were not equipped to face the cold of that night. Fortunately, there was no wind to beat the cold air through our clothing. Even the breeze from the ship's motion had died entirely away, for the engines had stopped again, and the Titanic lay peacefully on the surface, motionless.